All right. Welcome everyone to the National Advocacy Day Federal Issues Training webinar. My name is Phaedra Jackson. I am your Vice President of Unit Advocacy and Effectiveness, and I am joined tonight by an amazing team to get you briefed on some of our federal issue priorities. And so we're so excited that you all have joined us on a Thursday night to talk federal policy. We know that our nation is at a very interesting time, and we have opportunities ahead of us to really advocate for the issues that are impacting our communities and our daily lives. And so we want to make sure that you all are aware of those issues, the NAACP's policies around those issues, and some of the solutions to the policy problems. And so many of you may have participated earlier in this year in our state legislative advocacy week, where you were advocating at the state level around issues in your own state and in your community that are close to home. And so now, as we head into CBC Week, Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference, we have an opportunity to have our voices heard and to have folks lobby at the federal level. But everyone can't make it to DC, but everyone should know about these issues and where we stand and how they can advocate for them, because you don't have to come to DC to talk to your legislator, right? Like, they have to come home, they have to come in your district, they have to meet with you, their bosses who elect them. And so we are excited to bring a host of experts to talk to you about various issues and make sure that you've got all the information you need. Don't worry, this training will be recorded. So if you want to share it with others, you want to go back and watch it again, the deck, all of that will be made available to you in the coming days following this. But we wanted to kick this off with a great conversation. And then for those of you who happen to be in DC and want to join us when we go lobby on September the 11th, we'll have 30 minutes on the back end of this call to talk about kind of the logistics of going and advocating around federal policies that you care about, what it's like to set up meetings and talk to your legislator. So stick with us till the end. We've got a jam-packed schedule, but we're so excited to have this conversation with you and get started. And so now I am going to turn the call over to my colleague, Patrice Willoughby, our Senior Vice President of Global Strategy and Policy.
Hey, thank you, Phaedra, and greetings, everybody. We are so happy that you've joined us this evening. Let me repeat that because we are a policy advocacy organization, and we appreciate you participating in the process of bringing issues that are important to our communities, to our federal legislators. You know, advocacy is really enshrined in the Constitution as the right to petition the government. It's in the First Amendment. And it is a lifelong process. So don't let anyone ever intimidate you about your right to go and talk to legislators and to ask them for action on the issues that really impact you. We have, and we're going to give you a lot of information, but the thing for you to remember is the local effects that are important to you, and to put everything that you might hear and might want to bring to the attention of your congressmen and your senators to in public in plain English language. Be sure that when you speak with them, that you personalize why you're asking them for specific action on legislative priorities, policy priorities, and explain to them why it's important to you or how a specific issue affects you in your community. That's the only way that they know why it's important and why they should pay attention. The NAACP, as you know, has had a long history of policy advocacy, and we are really engaged in having these types of conversations with legislators, not just in Washington, D.C., but also in state houses around the country. and at the local and municipal level as well. So we will continue to have trainings like this to ensure that you have the information that you need, and we will have a Q&A at the end of this session so that you can launch questions in that might be answered. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking. Let us get to the program. We have the directors of our centers of innovation on the webinar today to give you an idea of those policies we talked about. And our next speaker is Keisha Bross, who is the director of our Center for Inclusive Economy. And I'll turn it over to Keisha.
Thank you so much, Patrice. It's a pleasure to see everyone tonight and talk about advocacy, especially around these topics that we know are so important to our voters, and it's so important in this upcoming election. So the first topic we're going to talk about tonight is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what does DEI mean? So before we even get into identifying the problem, we've heard a lot of different definitions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just want to let everyone know that DEI is not in response to the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd or Trayvon Martin. Though DEI efforts heightened across universities, corporate America, and within some parts of government, we know that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been something that the NAACP has been fighting for since its beginning. It is for people's equity and civil rights. So when you think about the history behind DEI, when you think about the civil rights, when you think about the fight for freedom, when you think about criminal justice, when you think about health, you think about environmental and climate justice, when you think about everything that we touch as Black and Brown people in this country, there is this conversation about equitable practices and solutions. And so DEI is under attack, and it's under attack nationally on many different avenues. So when you think about DEI and it's being under attack, I want you all to focus on not just the programs that you may see from universities or maybe a leader of DEI at a corporation, but think about it in these all avenues and facets of your life when it comes to the systems that impact you. All of our systems in America have a racist component. The systems were built on these racist practices, and why it is so important to identify that DEI is ongoing and has been historic is so that we can continue to combat, I'd say, negative intentions to really dismantle DEI and the progress and work. So some of the problems that we see with diversity, equity, and inclusion is, one, as I mentioned, we have 400 years of institutional racism, right? When it comes to housing and redlining, when you think about healthcare and some of the racist practices there, and I know that Dr. Purnell will talk about that. When you think about just the political, economic, and education systems and laws, there has been racist practices within them. These racist attacks on DEI aim to dismantle equitable practice. This is not about trends or buzzwords that we see now in corporate America. This is truly about understanding that there is a negative target driving an anti-Black agenda. I want to say that again. It is a target to drive an anti-Black agenda. So we know that all of the freedoms that we have been given through civil rights, through equal employment opportunity, all of those things, that is what's under attack. It's the right to have fair wage and job. It's the right to receive fair housing. It is the right to finances and practices. It's the right to education systems. It's the right that people have for equity. So the attempts are being made on the federal and state legislation. So if we see everything from the banning of books to removing critical race theory from our school systems to taking away Black history to dismantling DEI programs in universities across the country. So when we think about it, it's not just happening on a federal level, it's happening on a state level, it's happening at a local level, it's happening in your schools. People are trying actively to dismantle DEI programs. And the other part is corporations and post-secondary institutions are canceling DEI programs nationwide. So we've seen in the news recently that, universities are taking away DEI programs, they're taking away DEI departments, they're letting go DEI practitioners. And the same goes for when we think about corporations, the part of fair hiring practices, giving folks the opportunity for fair wage, those things are being challenged. We also have seen recently on the advocacy side, and I want to make our folks on the call know that DEI is also under attack when it comes to race-based data. So if any of you have had the opportunity, as an example, to read Project 2025, you will know that the intent of Project 2025 is to eliminate race-based data altogether. Well, what does that mean? It means that programs that are based on race to benefit Black and Brown communities, whether that be Small Business Administration, HUD, or any of those other agencies that are specific to race-based data, they're asking it to be eliminated, which means that it's going to be harder for Black and Brown people to receive equitable practices within finance that's already an issue now. So we also want to see that the race-based conversation stays relevant. So how do we continue to advocate for DEI? So our next slide. So here are the solutions that you all have the power to change. One, dismantling racism is voting out of office politicians whose agenda is to harm Black and Brown people. That is a hard statement. And what I mean by that is, if you know the politicians in your community, if you know the politicians at a state level, if you know the politicians at a national level are not for equitable practices, you have to have the power to vote them out of office. And what I have heard before is, well, I don't know and I don't like the candidate. Not voting is voting. And we have seen that in past elections. So making sure that you all are looking at different ways to vote out politicians and hold politicians accountable to equitable practices. Ask them what they're doing about DEI. Continue to push on housing opportunities for Black and Brown communities, access to capital, all of those things that are really important to what we think about in DEI. Voting ensures that politicians are responsible for equity, remaining accountable for laws and legislations. The other part is it's not just a federal conversation or this upcoming major election, but it's also about local and state politicians. I often see where folks maybe sometimes miss the mark when it comes to your council in your community, or maybe even your court systems or your judges in your community. Take every advantage to use your power of voting to dismantle racist practices. And that means from a local and state political place as well. And then, of course, it's really important if you all are working with a company, if you all have opportunities to meet with organizations, in addition to post-secondary education, make sure that you are advocating for DEI initiatives. It is a moral imperative that our next generation of leaders, our youth and college leaders, our folks, our kiddos in college and high school, have someone advocating for fair economic health, essential outcomes and social impact. And so advocating that companies, schools, your community has DEI initiatives is only going to help your next generation of leaders, which is the most important. The last thing I'm going to say about DEI, and I really want to make sure that the folks on the call know, is you're not just advocating for the today, you're advocating for history to not repeat itself and for us to continue in equitable progress. And so again, as I've seen companies say, it's in response to, DEI is not in response to anything. DEI is our right in this country to have equity and civil rights. And that is what you are fighting for, that foundation and framework, and why it's so important. So our next part, and part of DEI, actually the biggest part of DEI, is really looking at economy. And so economic empowerment is something that not only touches every single person in our community, but it's also one of the top issues that are in that voters are worried about. Economy is everything, right? When we think about how we think of finances, economic stimulation, income, housing, anything, economy is the basis of everything. And so when we advocate, and what I'll say about economy is it was really hard for me to just pick two topics because economy is everything that surrounds us when it comes to financial inclusion, right? And so there are two things that I know that right now are imperative to how our economy is functioning. And next slide. And the two are housing. And the other part that we're going to talk about in a few minutes is access to capital. But let's talk about housing first. So what do we know about housing? We know that housing is one, not the main, but one of the ways that someone can receive generational wealth. If you have housing and you continue to pay your mortgage on that housing, you build equity. And equity is an easy thing to pass down to the next generation, so then they have equity. So if they choose to sell that house, they have cash that they can put towards a bigger house, a better house. And that's how equity is established. And why generational wealth is so important is we want generations beyond us to be financially stable. We want them to have a system of income that continues to better our generations after us. So an example is, my parents and I are immigrants to America. We were not born here. One of the biggest things my parents wanted to do for us children was own a home. So now when they pass away, they're in their senior years, my sisters and I have something that we're able to use for wealth. And so that's a really important tool that we think about. However, housing is also one of the most difficult things in economy right now. And what that means is we are in an inflated market. The rates are high. They're at 6-7%. We are in a place where in housing have inflated housing prices, which means a house may at one point been 200,000, now it's 500,000, and it's hard for people to buy something of that size. In addition to, there is no federal oversight on renting. Rentals can be any price. It could be market price, it can be twice market price, and we also see parts of gentrification. Well, what does that mean? Gentrification means that you have an area that continues to push out low to moderate income people that tend to then have a wealth bracket that is beyond obtainable by the people who used to live there before. Gentrification generally happens in Black and Brown communities, and that's a large part of where redlining communities now have the ability to be bought out. And now it's this kind of reverse cycle where it's no longer low income or redline, but now it's gentrification where Black and Brown people who have history in those communities cannot afford to live in those communities. We also see discrimination when it comes to appraisals, and we see discrimination when it comes to inspections. So we know that white home buyers have a better advantage of getting a higher percentage in housing versus Black home buyers. And so the problems that we see that we are advocating for in housing is Black homeowners experience twice the denial rate. That is true today. Both the appraisal and insurance markets still experience discriminatory practices. Renters experience inflated rental prices, and more landlords are denying Section 8. This is a big issue, and I've heard this about this nationally, is a landlord does not have to include Section 8. And more landlords, because of the inflated market, are denying Section 8. And that is a really big issue for affordable renters market. So if you can't afford, 3 times the price of rent, you're going to need Section 8. So this has now become a problem. So what are we advocating for? What are we holding our politicians accountable to? Well, the solutions for housing are really actually simple. And it's a hard journey because housing has so much complex factors. But really, when you're thinking about advocacy, you want to fight for these things. One, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as we call CFPB, has jurisdiction to hold lenders accountable. So if you feel like you are being discriminated against in the housing space, whether that be by rental or whether that be by a financial institution, it's important that you report that to the CFPB or to HUD. And the reason why is they take those investigations seriously, and that allows folks to have equitable financial practices in the housing industry. The second is ensuring that policies are non-discriminatory for lending. So we see a lot of issues right now in the financial space where people, well, I would say banks want to remove Community Reinvestment Act and some of the different federal regulations that give them rules that they have to follow. And now sometimes that banks are money-making institutions, they may not want to always follow the rules. And so it's really important that we ensure that banks are still sticking to non-discriminatory lending. Providing continued and increased funding for certified housing counselors. I don't know about you, but I have never seen something more complicated than actually signing for a mortgage. It is a very complicated process. So housing counselors allows people to really understand what they're getting into, what an interest rate means, and how you actually work on a mortgage. And then providing assistance for foreclosures. And then the biggest here is making sure that we enforce the affirmative furthering fair housing, which is the AFFH. If you do not know what AFFH is, I encourage you to look up HUD, or I encourage you to look up AFFH at the National Fair Housing Alliance. They're actively advocating for fair housing. But what that means is furthering housing opportunities for Black and Brown communities that are one-time redlined, or as I said, making sure there are non-discriminatory lending practices. So housing, again, is the biggest way that someone can obtain generational wealth. And in order for us to continue to push housing options, we have to advocate for better housing solutions. And the last thing that I'd say about economy is access to capital. Next slide. So what do we know about access to capital? We know that traditionally Black and Brown communities, historically redline communities, did not receive access to capital. And when I say capital, I mean federal dollars. It's coming all the way from the top. There's a pocket of money that cities and communities can advocate for, and they don't necessarily get it, particularly Black and Brown ones in southern states. And so the other issue is, as we think about we're coming up to an election, which of your politicians are you advocating for that has control over monies and how they get into communities? That is what I'm looking at. So if you're advocating for, change in policy, or you're advocating at a national or federal level, who really has control of the money and how is it getting into Black and Brown communities? So what we do know is federal capital easily gets accessible by predominantly white communities versus predominantly Black communities. And some examples of that are the lack of federal funding to HBCUs in small southern states that are ran by white governors that may have issues with infrastructure and or cities that are predominantly Black. Jackson water crisis is a great example of how we look at that. And then when we think about just also revitalization and economic, stimulation, how are small businesses being generated and how are, again, big commercial projects being generated in Black community? So when you're going to your politician, here's what I would think that would be a great solution to those problems. The first, making sure we advocate for federal oversight. Well, what does that mean? Let me tell you. No place in an entire federal government is there oversight, meaning an office or an actual federal charge that keeps all of these governors accountable to the way the money is spent for federal dollars. I'm going to say that again. A governor that receives federal money for their state can use that money any which way they choose to without reporting requirements. There's no oversight. And so this is a problem because, as we've seen before, Black communities don't get the money, white communities do. So advocating for federal oversight is important. It's a crucial step to ensuring fairness and equity. So think about it this way. If you were up for election and everything that you had was not transparent, wouldn't you want to, then it became transparent, wouldn't you want someone to say, oh, is that person really doing what they should be doing or not be doing? So that's a good way for you to advocate for that. The second, making sure that states and local oversight. So this is not just a federal issue. Make sure that your mayors, make sure that your governors, make sure that your council folks are advocating for access to capital, but also being true and transparent. The other thing I would say is you have an opportunity to make sure that your minority depository institutions, MDIs, minority service institutions, MSIs, and HBCUs in your community are getting the money. I would fight for that. Those are the top three institutions that should get the money first when it comes to access to federal funds. And then more capital access to Black-led institutions would allow for easier projects. So if you're in a community that hasn't been revitalized in 20, 30 years due to urban renewal, guess what? There is federal money out there that could help you. It's just making sure you're advocating to the politicians that the money deserves to go into your community. So that is all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to answer questions, and you all are welcome to contact me. And now I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues, Dr. Chris Purnell, who's the director for the Center of Health Equity. So Dr. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Keisha. Good evening, everyone. Really excited to be before you tonight and to have a conversation about your health and your well-being. I'm the director of the Center for Health Equity. I'm also a public health and preventive medicine physician. So this is passion, purpose, and heart work for me. You can advance to the next slide. So as we think about advocating, I want you to understand how it is that we achieve health equity. I'll start first with the best definition of health equity. I've heard several definitions, and at times people may not truly understand exactly what health equity means. Best understood as the assurance of the optimal conditions for everyone to achieve their highest state or level of health. There are key words there. If you've ever heard me speak on this topic across any of our other platforms or events or series, I will always come back to this definition because it is so important. Language matters. Language provides a frame for mutual and shared understanding. And that mutual and shared understanding then becomes the seed, the basis, and the foundation for direct action and advocacy. So again, health equity is the assurance of the optimal conditions, so optimal settings, environments, whether those are policies, whether those are structures, or whether those are laws, or whether those are things, concrete, tangible things in your neighborhood or your house, right? The optimal conditions for every person, not some, not a few, not certain racial or ethnic groups, not people who earn at a certain social economic status, not those who may have been born here versus immigrant populations, not those who live in a certain geographic setting, rural versus urban, but all people to achieve their highest level of health. What you see before you is a graphic known as the cliff of good health. That definition that I just shared with you and this graphic were both authored by a pantheon in the field of health equity or health and racial justice, as many of us in the practice call it. And that's Dr. Camara Jones. Why am I saying that name? Because whenever I come across brilliance, especially Black brilliance, especially Black women who are brilliant, I want to uplift and amplify for all. So this graphic shows you what is happening at the population level that allows certain groups to be healthier, to be whole, and to be well. Okay, so you see this three-dimensional, if you will, cliff, and you see two different groups. One group is closer to the edge and another group is further away from the edge. Intuitively, we don't have to have any specialized training in health or healthcare to know that it's dangerous at the edge. I want you to think about who in your community. I want you to think about your own household, your families. I want you to think about your peer group, those you work with, those you go to church with, those that you may do recreation with, those who live down the street from you, where you were born, and unfortunately, the types of facilities that some of us may be in at the end of our lives. I'm describing to you the social determinants of health, and they structure those non-medical determinants, how populations live close to the edge and why other populations live further away. So that's best described as differences in exposures and opportunities. As Keisha was describing, do you have access to a job where you earn a livable wage or a living wage by which you have financial capital to invest in assets, one of which is home ownership? Okay, a different determinant or level at which disparities or inequalities arise around health and healthcare is differences in access to care. Where you live, do you have access to primary care physicians, the healthcare or hospital facility in your neighborhood? Do you have access to not only primary care, but the full spectrum of care, specialty care? Do you have access to preventive care? I say prevention is power, okay? That's an example of differences in access to care. We have so much data across the public health literature and otherwise that shows that things like zip codes actually determine your outcomes because sometimes it impacts what type of care you have available to you. And finally, there are differences in the quality of care received. Do you have a doctor that validates your experiences, whether those are your life experiences or how you present in their office or their clinic describing what's going on with your body? Do you have a doctor that is aware of how harmful implicit bias may be? Do you have a doctor who understands how racism operates as a system of structuring opportunity, whereby one group is preferentially advantaged and another group is preferentially disadvantaged? Do you have a doctor that shares the full complement of treatment options given your clinical diagnosis? And finally, do your healthcare providers, not just your physician, physician, maybe you see a nurse practitioner, but do your healthcare providers, do they understand the use and how detrimental the use of race-based algorithms have been in care? All of that is quality of care. So whether it's socially and culturally fluent, whether or not it's safe, whether or not it's the right amount at the right time and the right proportion. Okay, so that determines who lives close to the cliff, who falls off the cliff, what's there to catch them. Is there a fence? Is there a net? Are there holes in that net so large, AKA the safety net, that people fall through? And then, yes, there's an ambulance to catch them, but does it go in the wrong direction? Ways to illustrate the levels at which these disparities arise. So if you could advance the slide for me. Knowing that people live at various locations or stations along this cliff of good health, the purpose of tonight is to give you some let's say major and easily accessible priorities about how we move people away from the edge of the cliff and how we give people the assurance or the greatest opportunity to achieve their highest level of health. And so care, access to care. One thing that I want to say more than anything is we know that medical care is really roughly responsible for about 15 to 20% of your health outcomes. But if you don't have that ticket, if you can't produce that ticket, AKA your health insurance, then you are not able to what? To treat symptoms as they arrive or to receive the best prevention. So in order to ensure that the greatest amount of people in the population, especially in our Black and Brown communities, because of historical and contemporary injustices, have access to Medicaid. The goal is to expand Medicaid, and I'll describe this in greater detail as we go forward, but expand Medicaid as a way to ensure access. We'll also talk about universal health care and universal health coverage, which is the ultimate goal. Two, protect reproductive health care. Right now in the United States of America, reproductive justice is under attack. What is reproductive justice? It is the ability to choose and the right to parent, the right not to parent, and the right to raise or nurture your children in a healthful environment. That's what reproductive justice is. So there is a fight to protect reproductive health care. And that is so important because the majority of women who identify as Black and or African American live in geographic regions that are politically hostile to reproductive health care. And if the majority of Black women live in regions that are politically hostile to reproductive health care, then the majority of the Black woman population is at risk for not only not having access to reproductive care, but not receiving quality reproductive care. And the third priority is promoting food security. I'll go into this a little bit further as we advance to the last slide, why that's important, but you know, food matters. In public health, we say three phrases or sentences that I want you to remember, okay? Housing is healthcare, okay? And Keisha explained that for you, why housing is healthcare. Food is medicine and movement is life. If you could advance to the last slide. So again, think about that three-dimensional cliff that I showed you. Think about the goal is to move populations away from the cliff. If that is the goal, then when we are advocating before our policymakers and our decision makers at every level of government, but tonight explicitly before federal and national policymakers, there are three buckets that I want us to be able to pull our tools, our advocacy tools out of. Access and quality, and exposures and access. So under access, we're talking about, again, coverage, access to care, health insurance. And this is about that continuum of building out toward universal health care. So expanding Medicaid in states where Medicaid has not been expanded, reforming the eligibility process around Medicaid. Remember, Medicaid is for populations that are more marginalized and vulnerable because of of the income that they earn or their inability to earn an income. But often what we are finding, and we experienced through this most recent pandemic, is that Medicaid, as an example of a means-tested program, when it has all of this red tape, when it has all of these administrative barriers and hurdles, who gets harmed? Black and brown communities get harmed. During the pandemic, you were not allowed to kick anyone off of Medicaid. Once the public health emergency expired, states were able to go through a redetermination process, and hence people were terminated or kicked off of their Medicaid. It impacted over 25 million Americans. Based on historical data around who's enrolled in Medicaid, we know that most likely that has impacted the Black and brown community, because about 56% of beneficiaries on Medicaid are from communities of color. And almost 70% of those 25 million who were kicked off for an administrative reason, not because they were ineligible, but because they were missing paperwork, because they missed a deadline, because they never saw the notice telling them it was time to renew, because it was in a language that was not their first language and they needed assistance, or it was just too difficult or complex for them to understand. So one of the ways to reform the eligibility process is to do what? Make it a more automatic system. We call it ex parte system. Give people access to paperless applications, not the only way, but paperless applications. Allow people to qualify or their eligibility to be determined based off of SNAP. So we have income findings that are a part of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and or allow states to use income tax records. So that's an example of how to reform the eligibility process. And finally, remember, Medicaid is an important tool in that access equation, but the ultimate goal is building a universal healthcare system. Access and quality. I spoke briefly about reproductive justice. I spoke about reproductive healthcare being under assault. I spoke about how that is detrimentally impacting Black women who already shoulder the burden of maternal mortality. So advocating for the protection of reproductive care is of the utmost importance. We know that when a woman is the sole breadwinner in her household, if she does not have access to contraception, if she does not have access to family planning services, then she has less economic power. If she has less economic power, her ability to provide for her household and to protect her own health becomes endangered. So we want to dismantle barriers to whole person care. Yes, we want to ensure that abortion care is available to anyone who needs to use it, but I want you to put that in that broader umbrella of reproductive health care, because it affects issues like contraception, like family planning, in addition to whether a woman would need an abortion for some medical indication. And finally, under the exposure and access bucket, exposures meaning the environment in which you live, right? Access meaning health insurance, if you will. We want to promote food security. What? Food is medicine. And we know that approximately 42 million Americans access SNAP every month. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, because that is the level of hunger and food insecurity that we face in the United States that was heightened during the pandemic and continues to exist because of inflation. So what can we do about that? We can advocate for increasing federal assistance for SNAP and for WIC, women and infants and children. We know that approximately 12.5 million people are eligible for WIC. So those are very sizable swaths of the population. And again, what do we want to do? We want to streamline eligibility criteria. We want to remove the barriers, remove the red tape or the hurdles that make it harder from those who are more marginalized, more vulnerable to apply for and to access these programs. So these are just three quick policy priorities to pull out of that health equity toolkit. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you. And next up, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Cedric Haynes.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for that information, Dr. Chris. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today and for your commitment to advocacy. I'm Cedric Haynes. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs. As we prepare to walk into congressional offices on National Advocacy Day, it's really essential that we're united and clear about the education priorities of the NAACP. Our mission is to ensure that every student, particularly those from historically excluded communities, have access to fair, inclusive, and quality educations. Today, I'll be highlighting the key education-related issues we'll be advocating for in our meetings with legislators and their staffs on that day. Going to start with a hot topic right now, eliminating student debt. So this first section, we're really, really lucky and fortunate because on this call on the staff side, we are joined by an absolute champion, an advocate on this issue, and the tremendous progress that has been made of it, of course, is in no small part to him. So I'm going to ask Mr. Wisdom Cole if he could come on camera and unmute his mic for a second and kind of talk with us a little bit about some of the breaking news and headlines that are coming out surrounding student loans today and just about advocacy on this issue in general.
Thank you so much, Cedric. I really appreciate that. Again, good evening, everybody. Wisdom Cole, Senior National Director of Advocacy at your NAACP. I'm excited to be on the call with you this evening to talk about the elimination of student debt. As you all know, the NAACP has been a leading voice in the fight to cancel student debt because we were pushing the fact that the cancellation of student debt is a racial justice issue. As you've seen over the past 4 years, we've made great strides in this issue from pushing our administration to make sure that there was an equitable plan that was put in place. We saw that it got struck down at the Supreme Court, and we said that we were going to make sure that we were going to be at the table to negotiate the further cancellation that was going to happen around student debt forgiveness, and making sure that our members were a part of the heart of those plans moving forward. We've seen cancellation through public service loan forgiveness. We've seen changes to our loan forgiveness program through the SAVE program. Right now, in this moment in time, we are seeing attacks on all of the things that we have made gains on in this administration around student debt forgiveness, from a pause on the SAVE program to just breaking news happening today. We are seeing a temporary block on the new Biden student debt relief plan from federal judges. And so what does that mean for you all? It means that we still must advocate to ensure that we see further cancellation. From last year, we were able to see that we were given an on-ramp of 1 year where interest would occur, but folks would not be penalized for that interest occurring. Now that we are ending that 1 year on-ramp on October 1st, meaning that now penalties will impact you for not paying the interest. We still must advocate and push the administration to do what is right for our community and for all borrowers. And so part of what we're going to continue to advocate for, as our brother Cedric Hain has talked about, is making sure that Black students see equitable amounts of student debt cancellation. We are still fighting for full cancellation and full forgiveness because we recognize that it's not done until it's done, but also recognizing that the part that is the most impactful for the Black community is the amount of interest that is continuing to grow and grow upon the principal debt. And so we want to make sure that we are having conversations with our elected leaders, with the legislators, that we are recognizing that we are all student debt voters and that the impact of student debt cancellation has a really great opportunity to reduce the racial wealth gap in America today. And so through the work that we've done to collect your stories, the work that we've done to make sure that we are pushing the right advocacy points, we want to continue to meet our legislators where they're at and present this information because this fight is far from over. And so I'll turn it back over to Brother Cedric to finish out our policy points around education, but want to make sure that folks recognize that this fight is far from over.
I appreciate that, Wisdom. Thank you for your advocacy, everything that you've done on this issue, your leadership, and for helping me out because there's no way I could have said it any better myself. But if you could back up to the last slide or just pause here, I'm going to try and put a little bit of a finer point and do some top lines around student loans to do my best to pair with student debt disproportionately affects Black students and families. It limits opportunities for economic mobility and success. We, of course, strongly believe that eliminating student debt is critical for achieving racial and economic equity. Black students are more likely to take out loans and borrow more than their white counterparts. The racial wealth gap combined with predatory lending practices means that Black borrowers are often trapped in debt and it hinders all of our financial futures. I myself am also a student debt voter, to Wiz's point. So in our meetings with legislators or with their staff, we'll be calling for comprehensive student debt cancellation. As Wiz said, it's not done until it's done. We really need to ensure that the progress made through recent loan forgiveness efforts is not rolled back. Our goal is to relieve millions of borrowers, especially those from low and moderate income backgrounds who are carrying this financial burden. So while we're on Capitol Hill, what you really want to emphasize when you're speaking with congressional staffers or with members, we have to really emphasize and drill down on the long-term economic benefits of student debt cancellation. We really need to make it clear that eliminating student debt helps more Americans participate fully in the economy, and it creates a stronger and more equitable future. So expanding financial aid, the key message here is that access to higher education is key to breaking the cycle of poverty and closing the opportunity gap for Black students. Expanding financial aid will help more students afford college and complete their degrees. And it's important because the cost of college continues to rise. Every year we hear data, we receive data and we parse data about how the cost of tuition, the cost of college continues to rise. Financial aid remains a critical resource for Black students. So when you think about the current Pell Grant and other non-debt funding sources, grants or otherwise, it's not enough to cover the tuition and the living expenses, which forces many students to take out loans, which brings us back to the cycle of accruing student debt. So we're advocating for Congress to double the Pell Grant and award and expand eligibility to include more students. We also support debt-free solutions for students, especially those who are attending HBCUs and minority-serving institutions, but for our communities overall. So when we're visiting offices on Capitol Hill, we want to explain that increasing financial aid is an investment in the future. When we support HBCUs and expand Pell Grants or other debt-free ways to obtain an education, what we're doing is ensuring that more Black students can attend college without the burden of excessive debt. Could you go to the next slide, please? So protecting and expanding the teaching of Black history. Black history is essential to understanding the full story of America. It is critical that students in all states have access to an inclusive curriculum that reflects the contributions and the struggles of Black Americans. And what we're seeing and what we have seen across the United States on the state level, but also on the federal level, is efforts to ban the teaching of Black history and critical race theory. So these legislative actions erase the experiences of Black Americans and prevent students from understanding that the systemic racism that continues to affect our society in many, many ways every day. We are pushing for legislation that protects and expands the teaching of Black history in public schools. This includes opposing any laws that seek to limit or distort the teaching of Black history and advocating for curriculum standards that promote a full, truthful representation of our nation's past. So when we're visiting offices, what we really want to emphasize, we want to make it clear that Black history is not a political issue. It's about ensuring that all students receive a complete and accurate education. Ask them to stand against bills that threaten the inclusion of Black history in schools. And my last slide, or my next to last slide, I believe. And this really does tell you the importance of truthful and inclusive curriculums. If we want to foster a truly equitable society, our education system must reflect the diversity of our nation. Students need to engage with accurate and inclusive curriculums that allow them to think critically about the world around them. So there have been a number of efforts to exclude or to whitewash Black history from curriculums, and it undermines the progress that we have made in advancing racial justice. It's not just about history. This issue touches on how we prepare the next generation to address inequality in all forms. What we want to call for is for curriculum reform that includes the experiences of all communities, particularly those that have been historically excluded. A comprehensive curriculum benefits all students by promoting understanding, empathy, and also critical thinking. So as we're walking through Capitol Hill and having these meetings, in your discussions, you want to highlight the role that education plays in shaping future leaders. Ask legislators to support policies that promote truthful and inclusive curriculums and to oppose any efforts to censor or limit the teaching of Black history. And in conclusion, as we walk into congressional offices next week, we will be advocating for a brighter, more equitable future for all students. our educational priorities, which include eliminating student debt, protecting Black history, expanding financial aid, and promoting inclusive curriculums as well, financial aid and promoting inclusive curriculums are essential for breaking down systemic barriers and creating opportunities for the next generation. So as you meet with elected officials or their staffs on National Advocacy Day, remember that your voice matters. If you're from the district, share that. Share your personal stories, make connections between education and equity, and advocate for the policies that will shape a more just society for all of us. And I will turn it back to our host.
Thanks so much, Cedric, for that great rundown on how we can advocate on education at the federal level. And rounding out our slate of experts, we are going to turn to Ms. Jane English, the Fellow for our Community Resilience in the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice. Jane.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There we go. Okay, good evening, everyone. It is so wonderful that you've joined us for this evening. We can't do this without you. You are the leaders, and this is what you do every day, and we do it too. So we'd just like to support you in this opportunity to advocate on the Hill. So this evening, I'm only going to address two environmental justice issues that we want to take to the Hill. First is we want to prioritize opportunities for Black entrepreneurs in the green economy. And the second one is we want to call for a moratorium on energy shutoffs that we believe that they should be permanent. So as we move to the green economy, it is a major economic shift. I mean, let's look at a couple of them. Industrial Revolution, 1760 till about 1820, 1840. The Reconstruction period, we call it Black Reconstruction, 1860 to 1880. Jim Crow, 1896 to 1954. Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. 60s endowment programs, the 2008 mortgage debacle. Here we are, green economy. You will hear this every day. It is the most major shift and that we're going to see in this period of time, and this is going to be a permanent shift. We cannot, we are involved in this, but we have to accelerate our involvement, and we have to have all the tools, legislative, judicial, as well as advocacy to make this happen. We want a clear shift away from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And it must be systemic and equitable to ensure that communities of color, and in this instance, we're speaking of Black communities, that this systematic and equitable system are central, that we are central to designing this new energy economy. There's this White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council. It's made up of 25 cabinet secretaries led by Brenda Mallory, which many of us know. They have a directive that they follow. And this directive is basically a combination of executive orders that President Biden has issued when he first came into office, which very thoroughly, lay out what this equitable environmental justice landscape should look like. We suggest that this needs to be expanded. How? Well, first of all, and I meant to set my timer. I'm sorry, let me do that. Because I will go on and on about this. I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. So the reality is that consistent with and in addition to the Environmental Protection Agency's Equity Action Plan. And they have an Equity Action Plan, that's great. And it aligns with their 2022 to 2026 fiscal year budget. And so this strategic plan, what we recommend, we recommend several strategies to expand the Interagency Council directive to ensure racial justice includes equitable resource distribution. And that is a critical piece, resource distribution. So now, mandatory racial equity assessments. So we call for equity impact analysis. We say, okay, this is already on the books. It is indeed. However, we get one report per year. We are not involved, or we do not receive directly in our organizational leadership at the level that it needs to go to, and that is at the local level of how people of color communities, specifically Black communities, are benefiting from all of these various policies and projects. It has to be data-driven, and this data needs to be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and income to track resource distribution and outcomes. You know, what does it mean? It means, well, where's the money going? Right? How much money is there? Where is it going? And that's what we need a much more greater handle on it, because that is what impacts decision making. Targeted funding mechanisms. You say, well, we have that. You know, we have specific funding pools. Yes, we do. And some of them are definitely earmarked for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities. However, we need to know, do you know where the infrastructure money is being used in your community? Where are the infrastructure projects, clean energy, you know, environmental remediation projects? Where is it happening? Do you see any jobs being announced? Do you see any Black businesses being invited to come to the table to receive some of this money to build and rebuild things, to train people? So we need much more access to this and much more targeted funding where we know where it's come to. It shouldn't be in this vague knowledge of or vague announcement, oh, infrastructure money is going to all these states throughout the United States. It is, and it's getting there very fast. You may already know some of them in your community. We need to accelerate our understanding, and we need to accelerate how people are told about this and how this money is earmarked, okay? The one way that that bill was, the Infrastructure Inflation Act, was passed was because it's pork, right? Pork, remember that? You know, pork. That's what it's called on the L, pork. It means that they're going to have this money to come into communities. So you couldn't have these congressmen, regardless of what their political persuasions were, to say, oh no, I didn't want that money coming in my community. Leave me out of that pork barrel. No, 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 that wasn't going to happen. So they want that money to come into the communities. Well, we need to know where it's going. And we need to be positioned on the bodies that distribute that money, both at the federal, state, and local level. Community-driven planning and decision-making. So there's all these community advisory boards. So we're saying create more local advisory boards. And this needs to be made up of representatives, organic representatives from communities of color to basically supervise and guide the implementation of environmental justice. You know, there's always that axiom about if you don't plan, if you don't plan, that means you're a part of someone else's plan. There's a lot of truth in that. But decision-making power is where we want to be placed. NAACP representatives are constantly on all sorts of boards, going to all sorts of hearings. Okay, we also want to be in the decision-making agency positions, okay? I mean, we're talking 25 cabinet members are on this Economic Justice Council. Okay, so then these agencies that are under them should know where all this money is going and how we can be a part of not only the distribution of the money, the spending of the money, the recipient of the money, but participatory budget, how it's going to be spent. How do we influence that? And of course, enhancing interagency coordination. I used to always be skeptical of interagency anything because they were these really great boards that just, sat around, had coffee and talked about what their agents were going to do, what this was going to do, till I was a part of one time. And you'd be shocked at what goes on in those meetings. Many of you have already been to those meetings, so I know that. So, but what you will find out, if you don't know, is that housing, health, education, economic development, all of the things that my colleagues have talked about tonight, these cross-agency collaborations need to be mandatory. And of course, share accountability. Okay, I could go on and on about this. And we always want to strengthen legal and policy reform. We got the best lawyers in the United States. And there's already a significant number of civil rights acts and environmental justice civil rights acts on the books, consumer rights, and other rights. However, many of them are under attack. The biggest one that's under attack is the Voting the voting rights. This is critical. If we don't vote, everything I've said tonight and what my colleagues said is moot. And we've been here before too. We understand what we're up against. So what's interesting is capacity building and technical assistance. They always come to us for that. You know, they come to us every time they talk about capacity building technical assistance. Okay, we're the community organizers. We're the community-based organization. Fine. Well, everything I've talked about prior to this, in this part of the conversation, we want to be a part of that too. Of course, we want the capacity building and technical assistance money. We fought for it and we know how it should happen. Monitoring, prioritization of climate resiliency in vulnerable communities. Okay. Now I could go on. So you say, well, Jane, all of these things are already out there. Well, none of this is in contradiction to the existing targeting funding and investment programs that include Justice 40, Green for All Dream Corps, the Network of Black Environmental Leaders, Greenhouse Accelerators, Elemental Accelerators, any corporate supply diversity programs. And mind you, corporate supply diversity programs, they want to keep diversity in the mix because we spend a lot of money. We generate a lot of money. This was not some benevolent action when they wanted to integrate or establish rights or access. It's because they looked at our gross national product and said, whoa, we're missing out on all that money. Okay, but community and solar equity programs, HBCU partnerships, clean energy jobs and programs, and grant programs. So yes, that is what we want to do as far as our involvement in the green economy. We must demystify this. I won't get to talk much about this, but this is a critical piece. And this is where some action can be taken that we can concretely see results. We're calling for a moratorium on energy shutoffs. And we're saying it should be a permanent moratorium on energy shutoffs, okay, to protect low-income house communities. The electrical grid should transition to a publicly owned model versus an investor-owned model, limiting private ownership of community grids and residential community rooftops. For years, we have been trying, NAACP has been advocating, go solar. You know, let's do community grid, microgrids. Let's do commercial and residential solar rooftops. Well, big energy is like, once again, they recognize dollars, you know, at least we still have dollars, they recognize that. So now they're gonna try to take over this entire market and escalate the cost for everything like they have done in the traditional energy market and why our bills are so high, our energy bills are so high. It is important to acknowledge that this infrastructure bill provides billions and billions of dollars. So we're uniquely positioned as a country to we have this lifetime opportunity for microgrid development and other infrastructure. NAACP has been a long-term proponent of the elimination of utility disconnection. The need to incorporate human and civil rights in the utility business model is critical. So we want safe, sustainable energy production, of course. We want resilience, updated infrastructure, of course. Affordable energy, uninterrupted energy. So we're saying we want a moratorium on energy shutoffs. People die when that happens. Most of those shutoffs, most of the energy programs under COVID, of course, COVID-19, they halted the shutoffs. Well, now that's catching up with the United States and the consumers that are overburdened with high energy costs in the first place. Okay, so they have extreme weather, bans on shutting off people's electricity or other essential services, and they have seasonal bans. What we're saying is year-round permanent, year-round permanent ban on shutoffs. I'm just going to list these things. The other thing is public service commissions. Public service commissions are still made up of mostly non-working class white males, okay? We go to public utility commission meetings. I hear from ECJ leaders all over the country where, a rate is going to be increased. How do we work with this? How do we, South Carolina did it, they fought it and they won. They still got a rate increase, but it wasn't 21%, it was 6%. Those kind of differences to make. Many of us don't have the time to go and be a part of those public discussions. So we're cut out of the formula. Nonetheless, we need to continue to push to have public utility commissioners appointed from our communities or elected in instances where public utility commissioners are elected. So I'm just going to run down a couple of pieces of legislation that are afoot. Emergency Utility Shutoff Prevention Act, okay? It's stuck in the House, on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. No action on it right now, but that's the biggie, although it doesn't go far enough because it still limits it to extreme weather events and seasonal protections. There's a congressional subcommittee on energy, climate, and grid security. Interesting. The Federal Energy Regulation Commission, FERC, ECJ leaders, and many of you know what FERC is. It sounds weird, right? But it's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It regulates all utilities in the United States. Nothing budges without it, okay? I don't even want to go to talk about much about Project 2025, but like everything else constitutional, Trump's Project 2025 calls for independent commissions like FERC. They call them constitutionally problematic. Okay, okay. And during the prior administration, which was the Trump administration, if they thought it was their prerogative to completely, wholeheartedly support the fossil fuel industry at the expense of the paying public. So we battle with FERC from time to time. We do letters. You know, sometimes people go to the commission meetings and listen to that and get involved on the state and federal level. We have a wonderful policy and legislative office for the association. Highly, extremely intelligent, and very well qualified. So letters fly. They get letters from NAACP folks. They get phone calls like you wouldn't believe. So they say you come there like, oops, here come those NAACP leaders. One more time. Okay, but without FERC, as bad as it can be, it would be a disastrous energy scenario that would ensue in the United States. So we do want, FERC to stay in existence and to have public control over it, not the White House control only. And that would be a real problematic thing. The Federal Powers Act, for instance, explicitly conveys authority to FERC over the transmission of electricity in interstate commerce, okay? And so anytime you start talking interstate commerce, you get people's attention. So FERC actions have been repeatedly upheld by the courts. In fact, courts have long deferred to FERC on rate-making authority, even though we have to go to battle on the local levels on rate-making and go to hearings on rate changes, rate changes. However, FERC has the authority on, at the federal level without relying on the Chevron deference. And many of you know that's to almost put the lights out of every administrative, government agency that we have. They threw that out there last month, but nonetheless, the courts pay close attention to FERC when it comes to rate making and energy issues. There's also the Public Power Resilience Minority Grid Expansion Act. There's minority grid legislation. California and New York have taken the lead in supporting these efforts to legislation. California absolutely almost has to. They still have these rolling power outages that are planned, although it really is unbelievable what happens. Utility ownership and rooftop solar. We always say, go solar, go solar. So there's these big federal discussions underway regarding solar legislation to encourage the decentralization of power generation, such as through residential and commercial rooftop solar. This is definitely what we want. We want community-based or publicly owned microgrids, and they can coexist with the broader grid. Just think electrical grids. And more and more and more, as you're driving across the highway or on the train, you will see solar farms, solar grid farms. Somebody say, oh, I don't like that. Well, think, okay, your electric bill is going to go down as long as consumers stay at the table or build the table. However, there are two interesting issues about that. The mining of rare minerals to build solar panels, we always have to keep in mind, they come from the motherland, continent of Africa, and also from China. So those, just like any other mining, can be very dangerous, and it's still extractive. We want to get away from extractive economy to replenishing economies, right? And then there's the waste issue. Where do solar panels go when they become obsolete or flawed? Somehow, we know how. Waste dumps and landfills end up zoned into our communities. So we have to be mindful of that. But we still want community-based or publicly owned microgrids. Nonetheless, we have to be mindful of those issues as they arise. By way of example, Nebraska offers publicly owned model for their electrical grids, limiting private ownership to community microgrids and residential or commercial rooftops. We, some of us eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, but part of this is because we need to breathe, okay? And as long as those fossil fuels are being used to generate energy, the greenhouse gas emissions will constantly shut off our sources of clean air, clean water, and clean soil. I thank you, soil. I thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry if I went on a little too long, but I just really want you to know that that's a good question, Indana. We can talk about that. I can't talk about it tonight. It's a lengthy question and very complex, but we must keep that front and center, because what we're living under now is an extractive economy where, all these rare earth minerals are mined, primarily from the motherland, but also from China in large sums, huge, okay, with very debilitating working conditions. Okay, I come from a mining family, so that's near and dear to my heart.
Thank you so much, Miss Jane. Such
Thank
rich
you.
information.
Thank
I
you.
know we could give you your own 90 minutes and you would still be talking because it's such important and fruitful information. So thank you so much for that rundown.
Thank you.
And we are going to fly through this back half of the agenda because we know that there's still a little bit more information we want to get out to you all. So I'm going to quickly pass the call over to my colleague, our Senior National Director of Advocacy, Mr. Wisdom Cole.
Thank you so much, Phaedra. We have had a phenomenal webinar tonight where we have really talked about so many federal policy priorities of the association, everything from diversity, equity, inclusion, to economic empowerment, to health and well-being, to education, to environmental climate justice, really hitting all of the areas in which we call our strategic innovations. And so we really want to make sure that we are also making sure that this advocacy thing works, right? But that works with the members of the NAACP, that works with us making sure that each and every single day that we are holding our elected officials accountable. We're meeting them both in our in-district offices as well as here on Capitol Hill. We want to make sure that we are championing these issues. And so what I'm asking each and every single one of you today is to pull out your phones, to scan the QR code that you see on your screen. I'm also dropping a link here in the chat for you. You can click the link, you can scan the QR code, and in this link, you can choose to become an issue area champion, right? If there is an issue area that spoke to you in your community tonight, I want you to signify that that is the issue that you are going to be champion, that you are going to be making sure that you are leading within your community, within the NAACP, and supporting these campaigns and initiatives, as well as advocacy asks in each of these areas, right? You don't just have to choose one. You can choose multiple. If there are multiple issues that speak to you, that you say, hey, I want to be working on this, I want to be at the front line. Many of these strategy directors actually lead working groups each and every single month that support the continuous organizing, real-time updates, as well as continual advocacy efforts that we do year round, right? And recognizing that this is an election year, we know that issues are what's going to drive our community to the ballot. And so I want you to take a couple minutes just to scan the QR code here, to click the link, use the link here. I'm going to try to drop it here one more time. You can copy and paste that. You can click it. I'm going to try to create a clickable one that you can just do it in the chat. But want you to be able to use that link to choose what issue area that you want to be a part of. In addition, we want to make sure that we are consistently enhancing our presentations, our trainings, our support for NAACP members out in the field. And so there are a couple questions below you choosing which issue areas you want to be a champion for that can help us improve our trainings. What I want you to do is to fill that out, drop a thumbs up in the chat once you've completed that. I know that we are short on time this evening, and so I want you just to continue working on filling that out. But as we continue on with our presentation, I want to turn it over to our National Director of Advocacy, Corey Johnson, to really start talking about why we are gathered here this evening, what's coming up next week. Our VP, Phaedra Jackson, talked about this a little bit earlier, but we want to go into details about what National Advocacy Day is really about for those who are going to be participating in that. And so I'm going to pass it over to Corey Johnson now.
Thank you, Wisdom. Good evening, freedom fighters. As we've highlighted from our center directors and our team members, there are so many issue areas that require our advocacy attention because our people are being impacted from a myriad of issues plaguing marginalized communities. We are sitting in a very unique time in the wake of Project 2025, where so many issues are impacting Black people across the country. Access to birth control, quality healthcare, attacks on DEI initiatives, the banning of educational materials that will shape how our stories and that of our ancestors gets told in this country. And we can move to the next slide. Well, I guess 2 slides after. But so as an organization, as an association, we know all too well that our role within the United States civic landscape has been the moral backbone of our social democracy, from block voting to freedom rides, from the courthouse to the state house. It is imperative that we carry the tradition of illuminating the issues happening in our communities and to uplift the voices of marginalized communities across the country. And so as we gear up for this election, we are taking our advocacy not just to the polls, but also to our elected officials that represent us in Congress. And so during CBC, the NAACP is hosting National Advocacy Day on September 11th, 2024, where we will be speaking one-on-one with Congress people to talk about issues that are impacting our people and our communities. And so with that being said, our team is looking for freedom fighters that are interested in using their voices to impact federal policy. And so you can see the date and time here, our flyer, the location. We will also be sending this out via email to our participants that have registered as well. We will have a host of materials from federal priority talking points, a map of the congressional offices, contact list, so much, much, much more. If you have any questions, concerns, feel free to contact me, Mandela, Wisdom, and we have our email addresses listed. We'll also pop those in the chat as well. And we can go to the next slide. In terms of some of the other logistics we'll get into at a later date. But I want to highlight, like Assata Shakur said, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And so here you'll see sort of the agenda for National Advocacy Day, what we hope to do next Wednesday. And if folks have any questions, concerns, anything like that, please drop them in the Q&A. We'll also send out the links, and you can scan this QR as well, and it'll take you straight to the actual registration. Please send this to colleagues. Please send this to bosses. Please send this to your member base. Any folks that you feel would be interested in supporting the initiatives that we've talked about today, feel free to invite them to register. And this is the registration webpage. And with that, I will pass it over, I believe, to Cedric and Wisdom just to talk a little bit about office visit training.
Thanks for that, Corey. I'm going to be incredibly brief for a couple of reasons. One, we are down to our last 4 minutes, and two, A part of the agenda that Corey just showed states that we will be doing the exact training or fleshed out training that I'm supposed to do now in person in DC before we all go advocate. So I'm just going to hit some top lines on what to expect. If you have never been to Capitol Hill and you're coming to Capitol Hill, it is a massive and a sprawling complex. I would strongly advise that you wear comfortable shoes, as getting to and from the buildings and between them will require a lot of walking. Some very, very quick points. When you enter an office, you always want to ask for the congressman or the senator if they are unavailable, which they often are because they carry tremendously busy schedules. You want to ask for a legislative director or the staffer who handles civil rights issues. And you should be prepared that you may need to deliver your talking points directly to the person at the front desk, which is perfectly fine, and that's okay if the key staffers or the member themselves are unavailable. Delivering your message. I know that many of us have advocated in our city halls, our state capitals, and on Capitol Hill before, but just in case you have not, or you're feeling just a little bit uncomfortable, we will be providing you with talking points. We also will have a leave behind that is a listing of the major policy priorities to Congress that includes the ones that we have discussed today of the NAACP. Back to the talking points, there's absolutely nothing wrong with reading from it. If you want to read from it, that is completely fine. Alternatively, and preferably when you walk into a congressional office, it can be helpful if you have a personal connection with the district. I'm from the 2nd Congressional District of Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, to be exact. Were I to walk into Congressman Benny Thompson's office, it would be one of the first things I said when I walked through the door. Feel free to share your story. Focus on being concise, focus on being clear, focus on emphasizing the issues that affect your district if you're from that district, or the issues that will be in the handout that we will give you. You always want to gather some information. Ask for a business card of a legislative director. Ask for a business card of the staffer who handles civil rights issue. This information will be critical if there's any follow-up in particular that's needed after the meeting. Leave behind materials. We are going to give you copies of the federal policy priorities that I mentioned before. It is meant to be left in every office so that the staffers can see it and understand what's on our agenda as we move ahead. And the last thing I'll say is, in these meetings, stay professional and stay engaged, whether you're speaking to a congressperson, whether you're speaking to a legislative director, whether you're speaking to a staff assistant, whether you're speaking to an intern. Stay professional, stay focused, stay cordial, stay engaged, and your role on that day is really going to be essential in making sure that our priorities are heard. So I will end there and hand it back to our MC. Oh, sorry, I will hand it to Manla Deskins. Manla, are you there?
Sorry, I'm here. I was managing questions in the Q&A section and had turned my camera off. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I think I'm actually plugged here, but good evening, everyone. As Cedric described already, we're really excited to see you for National Advocacy Day. And we have added the information in the chat for folks to RSVP. And we look forward to seeing you in DC in a couple of days. I think that was it. So with that, I'll pass it back to the MC for the Q&A.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks, everyone. We did our best to answer your questions in real time. We did see one or two, so we'll try and answer those. But we also want to respect your time. It is 8:30. So there is a question about, can we get the recording? I'm sorry you were dropped off a few times, Bernard, but yes. So we, as a habit, we try to record all of our trainings, and we take the decks and we'll package them up and get them out to you following. It probably won't be this week since there's only one day left in the week, but we will do our best to get these out. If not next week, very early the following week. It just depends on capacity to get them uploaded and then sent back out. But we will definitely make sure that you can get these so you can replay them for yourselves, or so that you can share them with other folks in your branch and in your community. Um, Someone asked if there opportunities for local people to start businesses in the green economy. Do one of our panelists want to answer that question?
Yes. Um, this is Jane. Is there a way to start businesses in the local economy, green businesses?
Mm-hmm. Is there
Yes,
an opportunity?
yes, there are. You need to check with your um, your community economic development office. Most local jurisdictions have, or municipalities have that now, but also connect up with other small businesses and get the scoop. Always do that. And just do a little research, but yes, there is some startup money, but you will have to have some capital and you will also have to have a business plan and some training.
Got it. Thank you for that. I'm going to do two more and then I'm going to let us go. If you have other questions, drop them in the chat. We'll aggregate. We'll start a frequently asked questions document and share those out. Last two questions. Michaela Myers asked, will there be anything specific for youth in college? Michaela, I would love to know more about what you're looking for youth in college. Are you looking for pullouts for each of these issues for youth in college? If you want to type it in the chat or raise your hand, we can let you come off mute. And then finally, I'm gonna go to Claudia Swansea. Um, you can come off mute and ask your question. Claudia, if you still have a question, you should be able to unmute. All right. Well, feel free to type it in the chat. We thank you all so much for your participation. Thanks for hanging in with us for 90 minutes on a Thursday evening. We hope that this information was helpful for you. We are ready to be strong advocates for our community. I say thank you to all of our experts and our staff that got on this call and brought this information. But most importantly, I say thank you to you because this work does not continue without your advocacy, your efforts, and your heart. So thank you so much and have a wonderful night, everyone.